In the annals of history, few legends are as grotesque as they are revealing about the human condition. Picture this: a queen so consumed by religious fervor that she vowed never to change her undergarments until her holy war was complete. For nearly a decade, Isabella of Castile allegedly wore the same linen underclothes, creating a walking pestilence that would horrify even the most hardened medieval courtier. This is not merely a tale of poor hygiene. It is a window into the darkest corners of fanaticism, where devotion becomes obsession and obsession breeds monstrosity. The woman we know as Isabella the Catholic was born into a world where the very concept of Spain did not exist. In 1451, the Iberian Peninsula was a fractured mosaic of Christian kingdoms and Muslim emirates, locked in an 800-year struggle that had claimed countless lives. The Reconquista, as it came to be known, was not merely a political campaign, but a holy war that had consumed generations. Isabella's birth coincided with the twilight of this cosmic struggle, yet she would become its most ruthless architect. When Isabella ascended to the throne of Castile in 1474, she inherited more than a crown. She inherited a divine mission that would define every breath she took until her death. The young queen possessed an intelligence that was as sharp as it was dangerous, coupled with a religious conviction that bordered on the pathological. Her marriage to Ferdinand of Aragon was not born of love, but of cold political calculation, uniting two of the most powerful Christian kingdoms on the peninsula. Together, they would forge a weapon of unprecedented power against the Muslim presence in Granada. The legend of Isabella's unwashed undergarments began with what historians believe was a moment of theatrical religious fervor. In 1482, as she prepared to launch the final phase of the Reconquista against the Emirate of Granada, the queen allegedly made a sacred vow before her courtiers and clergy. She swore by the Virgin Mary that she would not change her chemise, the linen undergarment worn next to the skin, until the last Muslim stronghold fell to Christian forces. What began as a gesture of pious determination would evolve into something far more sinister. Medieval hygiene was already a foreign concept to modern sensibilities, but even by the standards of the 15th century, Isabella's vow was extreme. The wealthy typically changed their linen undergarments weekly, while the poor might go months, but a decade. Court chronicles began to document the queen's transformation from a radiant young ruler to something that inspired both awe and revulsion. The same chemise that had once been white as fresh snow gradually took on the yellow-brown patina of accumulated sweat, blood, and bodily secretions. As the years passed, the queen's self-imposed penance began to manifest in ways that went far beyond mere unpleasantness. Court physicians, writing in carefully coded language to avoid royal wrath, documented the appearance of persistent skin irritations and what they delicately termed corruptions of the flesh. The constant friction of unwashed fabric against skin created open sores that never properly healed. These wounds, in turn, became breeding grounds for bacteria and parasites that would have been unimaginable even in that age of poor sanitation. The psychological impact on Isabella herself was equally disturbing. Contemporary accounts describe a gradual shift in her demeanor as the siege of Granada dragged on. The queen, who had once been known for her diplomatic skills and measured approach to governance, began to exhibit signs of what modern psychologists might recognize as obsessive-compulsive behavior. She became fixated on ritual purity in all aspects of life, except for this one glaring exception, creating a cognitive dissonance that manifested in increasingly erratic decision-making. The courtiers who served Isabella during this period found themselves trapped in a nightmare of etiquette and endurance. Protocol demanded that they remain close to their sovereign during audiences and ceremonies, yet the stench emanating from the queen became so overwhelming that many developed chronic respiratory problems. Visiting dignitaries from other European courts returned home with tales of the Spanish queen, who smelled like a battlefield 3 days after the carnage had ended. The siege of Granada itself became a reflection of Isabella's internal state, a protracted, obsessive campaign that consumed resources and lives with reckless abandon. What could have been accomplished through diplomatic negotiation or even a swift military assault instead became a 10-year war of attrition that transformed the queen into something monstrous. Her religious advisors, recognizing the psychological hold that the vow had taken, dared not suggest that God might release her from such an extreme commitment. Contemporary Islamic sources from Granada described the Christian queen in terms that blur the line between military strategy and supernatural horror. To the defenders of the last Muslim stronghold in Iberia, Isabella had become a living symbol of Christian fanaticism, a woman so consumed by hatred for their faith that she had literally allowed her body to rot in service of their destruction. These accounts, while certainly colored by the propaganda needs of a desperate siege, nonetheless provide a chilling portrait of how the queen's vow had taken on mythic proportions. As the siege entered its final years, even Isabella's closest allies began to worry about the long-term consequences of her condition. Cardinal Mendoza, her most trusted advisor, wrote in private correspondence about his fears that the queen's deteriorating physical state might be affecting her judgment in matters of state. He described witnessing Isabella scratch at herself compulsively during council meetings, leaving bloody marks on her arms and neck that would remain visible for days. The medical understanding of the time linked physical corruption with spiritual corruption, creating a dangerous feedback loop in Isabella's psyche. The more her body deteriorated, the more convinced she became that she was being tested by God, requiring even greater demonstrations of faith and commitment. This mindset would prove catastrophic for the non-Christian populations of Spain, as the Queen's personal obsessions began to manifest in increasingly violent policies. The Queen's physical condition also had devastating effects on those closest to her. Her ladies-in-waiting, required to help dress and undress their sovereign, were exposed daily to the consequences of her vow. Several developed chronic illnesses that court physicians attributed to corrupted vapors emanating from the royal presence. Modern medical understanding suggests these women likely suffered from respiratory infections, skin conditions, and possibly parasitic infestations transmitted through close contact with Isabella's contaminated clothing. The psychological torture extended beyond mere physical discomfort. Isabella's insistence on maintaining the charade of normalcy meant that courtiers were forbidden from acknowledging the obvious reality of her condition. Those who showed any sign of revulsion or discomfort in the Queen's presence faced immediate banishment or worse. This created an atmosphere of forced denial that permeated the entire court, where the evidence of their senses was subordinated to the demands of royal protocol. When Granada finally fell on January 2, 1492, after nearly 10 years of siege, Isabella's moment of triumph was simultaneously her greatest horror. Contemporary accounts describe the Queen's chemise as having essentially fused with her skin in places, requiring careful attention from physicians to remove without causing severe injury. The fabric had become so saturated with bodily fluids and so thoroughly colonized by bacteria that it had begun to break down at the molecular level, creating a second skin of corruption. The immediate aftermath of the vow's completion revealed the true extent of the damage Isabella had inflicted upon herself. Physicians found extensive scarring, chronic infections, and what appeared to be early signs of sepsis that would plague her for the remainder of her life. The Queen's immune system had been so compromised by years of exposure to her own waste products that she became susceptible to every minor illness that passed through the court. Her recovery would take months, during which she remained largely sequestered from public view. Yet even as Isabella underwent the painful process of physical rehabilitation, she was simultaneously orchestrating some of the darkest chapters in Spanish history. The Alhambra Decree, issued just 3 months after Granada's fall, gave Spain's Jewish population a choice that was no choice at all: convert to Christianity or face expulsion. This act of ethnic and religious cleansing displaced hundreds of thousands of people who had called Iberia home for over a millennium, creating a refugee crisis that rippled across the Mediterranean world. The Spanish Inquisition, formally established under Isabella's authority in 1478, reached its most horrific peak in the years following Granada's conquest. The same obsessive religious fervor that had driven the Queen to maintain her grotesque vow now manifested in systematic torture, confiscation of property, and mass executions. The autos de fe, public burnings of heretics, became regular entertainment in Spanish cities, with Isabella herself attending these spectacles as acts of religious devotion. The connection between Isabella's personal extremism and her governmental policies was not lost on contemporary observers. Foreign ambassadors noted that the Queen, who had subjected herself to such physical degradation, seemed incapable of recognizing the suffering she inflicted on others. The same mindset that viewed her rotting chemise as a badge of spiritual honor also saw the torture chambers of the Inquisition as instruments of divine justice. The irony of Isabella's crusade for religious purity becomes even more apparent when considering the broader context of her reign. While she was literally purging her kingdom of non-Christians, she was simultaneously financing Christopher Columbus's voyage to the New World. The same treasury that funded the Inquisition's reign of terror also supported the expedition that would bring Christianity to the Americas through conquest, enslavement, and cultural genocide. Columbus himself left conflicting accounts of his interactions with the Queen during the negotiations for his voyage. While he praised her vision and determination, his private journals contained veiled references to the peculiar aspects of the royal court. Some historians have suggested that the navigator's well-documented nervous disposition during his time in Spain may have been related to the traumatic experience of conducting business in Isabella's presence during the final years of her vow. The financing of Columbus's expedition also reveals the brutal arithmetic of Isabella's reign. The gold and valuables confiscated from expelled Jewish families and condemned heretics provided a significant portion of the funds needed for the voyage. In essence, the same religious fanaticism that led to Isabella's physical self-destruction also enabled the economic mechanisms that would reshape the global balance of power for centuries to come. The psychological profile that emerges from Isabella's actions during this period suggests a ruler whose judgment had been fundamentally compromised by her extreme religious practices. The same obsessive-compulsive tendencies that prevented her from changing her undergarments also manifested in her inability to moderate her policies toward religious minorities. Every decision became a test of faith rather than a matter of practical governance. The court culture that developed around Isabella's extremism created a feedback loop of ever-increasing fanaticism. Nobles and clergy competed to demonstrate their piety, through increasingly elaborate and painful demonstrations of faith. Self-flagellation became commonplace among court officials, while extreme fasting and sleep deprivation were seen as signs of spiritual advancement. The Queen's rotting chemise became the gold standard for religious devotion, inspiring imitators throughout the Spanish nobility. The long-term health consequences of Isabella's vow extended far beyond her personal suffering. The chronic infections she developed appeared to have affected her reproductive health, contributing to multiple miscarriages and the death of several children in infancy. The queen who had sacrificed her body for the conquest of Granada ultimately sacrificed her dynasty's future stability, as the succession crises following her death in 1504 would plunge Spain into decades of political uncertainty. The legend of Isabella's undergarments has been sanitized and mythologized over the centuries, transformed from a tale of pathological obsession into one of noble sacrifice. Spanish nationalist historians have portrayed the vow as evidence of the Queen's unwavering commitment to her people and faith. This revisionist narrative conveniently ignores the documented suffering of both Isabella herself and the countless victims of her religious policies. Modern medical analysis of the few surviving contemporary accounts suggests that Isabella's condition may have contributed to the spread of various diseases throughout her court and potentially beyond. The combination of chronic infections, poor hygiene, and close contact with numerous courtiers and visiting dignitaries created ideal conditions for the transmission of bacterial and parasitic diseases. Some epidemiologists have speculated about connections between court outbreaks during this period and Isabella's deteriorating physical condition. The psychological impact of Isabella's extremism extended to her immediate family, particularly her children. Her daughter Joanna, who would later be known as Joanna the Mad, displayed signs of severe mental illness that some historians have linked to the traumatic environment of her mother's court. Growing up in an atmosphere where physical self-destruction was celebrated as a spiritual achievement may have contributed to Joanna's later psychological breakdown and inability to govern effectively. The religious establishment of the time found itself in an increasingly uncomfortable position regarding Isabella's vow. While they had initially blessed her commitment, the obvious deterioration of her physical and mental health created theological problems. How could they condemn her extremism without undermining the very foundations of the religious war they had spent decades promoting? The solution was a careful dance of public praise and private concern that characterized much of the late medieval church's approach to lay mysticism. Foreign courts watched Isabella's descent into obsession with a mixture of horror and fascination. The French court, traditionally Spain's rival, used accounts of the Spanish queen's condition as propaganda against Spanish power and influence. English observers, writing for Henry VII, described Isabella's court as a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious extremism. These international perspectives provide valuable insights into how Isabella's personal choices affected Spain's diplomatic relationships. The economic costs of Isabella's obsessions were equally staggering. The resources devoted to the prolonged siege of Granada, funded partially by the proceeds of religious persecution, represent one of history's most expensive acts of royal vanity. Economic historians estimate that the 10-year campaign cost roughly the equivalent of 50 years of normal royal revenue, creating debt burdens that would plague Spain for generations. The cultural legacy of Isabella's reign reflects the same disturbing contradictions embodied in her personal vow. She is simultaneously celebrated as the architect of Spanish unity and condemned as the architect of Spanish intolerance. The same determination that drove her to endure a decade of physical degradation also drove her to create institutions and policies that would define Spanish identity for centuries. The Inquisition outlasted her by over 3 centuries, while the expulsion of Jews and Muslims created cultural and economic wounds that Spain has never fully healed. Archaeological evidence from sites associated with Isabella's court has provided disturbing confirmation of contemporary accounts. Excavations at royal residences used during the Granada campaign have uncovered evidence of widespread disease, poor sanitation, and what appears to be systematic attempts to mask underlying health problems through the use of heavy perfumes and incense. The material culture of Isabella's court reflects a society in deep denial about its own dysfunction. The influence of Isabella's example on subsequent Spanish rulers cannot be understated. Her grandson, Charles V, would inherit not only her territories, but also her conviction that personal suffering was essential to effective governance. The Habsburg dynasty's tendency toward religious extremism and political inflexibility can be traced directly to the precedents set during Isabella's reign. The idea that a ruler should embody the faith through personal sacrifice became a defining characteristic of Spanish monarchy. The medical consequences of Isabella's vow also extended to her understanding of health and disease among her subjects. The queen, who had deliberately compromised her own immune system, showed little sympathy for those suffering from plague, disease, or malnutrition. Her policies toward public health reflected the same logic that guided her personal choices. Suffering was divinely ordained, and attempts to alleviate it might interfere with God's plan. The technological and intellectual stagnation that characterized much of Isabella's later reign can also be linked to the atmosphere of extremism she fostered. Scientific inquiry, artistic innovation, and philosophical debate all require a certain degree of intellectual freedom that was incompatible with the rigid orthodoxy Isabella imposed. The same mindset that prevented her from acknowledging the obvious problems with her personal hygiene also prevented Spanish society from adapting to changing circumstances. The role of Isabella's confessors and spiritual advisors in maintaining her destructive vow raises serious questions about the ethics of religious counsel. These men, who had daily access to the queen and could observe the obvious deterioration of her condition, chose to reinforce rather than moderate her extremism. Their correspondence reveals a calculated decision to prioritize political and religious objectives over their sovereign's health and well-being. The deathbed scene described by contemporary chroniclers provides a fitting conclusion to Isabella's tragic story. Surrounded by the smell of incense intended to mask other odors, attended by physicians who dared not speak honestly about her condition, and blessed by clergy who had enabled her self-destruction, the queen died as she had lived in her final years, trapped by the consequences of her own extremism. Yet perhaps the most disturbing aspect of Isabella's legacy is not what she did to herself, but what her example authorized others to do in the name of faith and purity. The Inquisition's torture chambers, the expulsion of entire populations, and the destruction of centuries-old communities all followed logically from the premise that physical and spiritual suffering were not only acceptable but necessary for the achievement of religious objectives. The queen, who rotted in her own chemise for a decade, created a moral framework that would justify centuries of institutionalized cruelty. The final tragedy of Isabella's story may be that she achieved everything she sought while destroying everything she claimed to value. She unified Spain through the elimination of diversity, established Catholic supremacy through the abandonment of Christian mercy, and secured her legacy through actions that would ultimately undermine Spanish power for centuries to come. The queen who sacrificed her body for her faith created a kingdom that would sacrifice its soul for the illusion of purity. In the end, Isabella of Castile stands as a monument to the dangerous seduction of extremism and the terrible price of fanaticism unchecked by reason or compassion. Her putrid chemise, worn for nearly a decade in service of a holy war, became a symbol not of devotion, but of the corruption that inevitably follows when human judgment is subordinated to abstract ideals. The Spanish queen who never changed her underwear reminds us that the distance between saint and monster is often measured not in intention but in consequence, and that the most dangerous individuals in history are often those who believe most fervently in their own righteousness.